Let's talk Dungeons & Dragons character creation, and more specifically, how to create a good Dungeons & Dragons character for roleplay. We aren't going to go into any power gaming, how to make the most broken builds, most powerful multi-classes, nothing like that. This is simply how do you make a good character that is good for storytelling, good in a story, and overall good for roleplay. First, as always, a disclaimer, what I am talking about is going to be in general. And of course, your experiences may vary from table to table, game to game, story to story. And this will be taking into account Dungeons and Dragons as it's presented as typically a high fantasy game. What works in a high fantasy setting, of course, may not work in a realistic setting or a sci fi setting or an apocalyptic setting or those sorts of things. So bear in mind, this is specifically for a generic high fantasy standard Dungeons and Dragons character. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's jump right into it. Tip number one. Most people do character creation backwards, in that they first decide what class they want to play and then they create a character around that. But if you want to tell a better story or have a more well rounded character or character story, try instead trying to figure out before the class, figure out what story do I want to tell? What themes do I want to explore? And once you have a general idea of those themes, that can help you to select a species/race and class. So let's use it in an example. Rather than saying, all right, time to roll up a new character in a game, I'm going to play a human fighter. I'm going to say for this character, I want to explore the themes of a retired veteran who is tired of fighting but is called back into the fray. Someone who is maybe a guard or served as a bodyguard or in some way is tired of fighting and doesn't want to fight anymore. It's a very tropey theme, but I think it's a very good one and one that's interesting to explore in D&D, especially if you want to try and do like a pacifist character or someone who doesn't like fighting. You have the trope of like the reluctant hero, someone who doesn't want to do this but keeps getting dragged back into it, whether it be by fate or choices or company. There's a lot of opportunity there to role play with your fellow players. And now I know what theme I want to explore. Certainly, I could be a human fighter. That's very, very, very generic, but it works great. But also, I can do something like a monk, someone who has cloistered themselves away from the world to try and avoid the fighting. Now I have questions. Why are they called back into fighting? What led them to being a monk? It also helps with narrowing down a species and/or race. Certainly, human fits perfectly well. But now I have options to consider. Well, what if they're a more long-lived race, like an elf or some sort of fae, who has been fighting a whole lot longer than a human ever possibly could? What if they're a short-lived race, like kobolds? I think they can only live, like 15, maybe 20 years, depending on your world, if that. Maybe they've been fighting since they were born, and now they're 4 years old and they've only got maybe 10 years left and they don't want to do it anymore. By starting with the themes you want to explore, it gives you a lot more questions to ask to make your character a lot more rounded, a lot more three-dimensional, and ultimately that's the goal. The more real your character is, the more emotions they have, the more reasons they have to do things, the easier it is going to be for you to get into that character's mind and roleplay them. Tip number two, tropes. Now, you'll have some people who will tell you that tropes are good, and some people will tell you tropes are bad. We've all laughed at the horny bard tropes. We've all talked about the rogue betraying the party tropes, or the lawful stupid paladin tropes. Those are all tropes, and they're not necessarily good or bad, overplayed potentially. But consider tropes to be spices in cooking. Cinnamon and sugar are certainly delicious in oatmeals or on bread, but you certainly wouldn't put it on macaroni and cheese or in your tuna casserole. So knowing where to apply those tropes is important, and there are good stories that can be told with the angry barbarian or the lone wolf ranger or the lawful stupid paladin. Those tropes exist for a reason, as people like those tropes and like playing as those characters, and there are good stories to be had in there if you use it sparingly and know where to apply it. For example, let's go with the lone wolf or the lone ranger sort of trope, someone who doesn't want to be a part of the party or prefers to be alone. I think some pretty well-known examples of this, you could go like Vegeta from Dragon Ball Z, Iron Man from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Characters who prefer to do things their way and be alone, but inevitably end up forced to be with other people for various reasons, usually beyond their control. And a big reason why those characters work is because there is one writer who is writing the entire story. So when they don't want to go along with the party or they don't want to be involved, the creator can just say, well, they have to because XYZ happens. It's very convenient because the writer gets to make the conveniences. But when you're doing collaborative storytelling, that's much harder to do. A lot of people do this cold start in the tavern, where your characters don't know each other and there's some sort of call to action. There's some sort of tavern brawl. A big job gets posted and everyone says, let's come together and get this job done. It's cliche and it works. But if you're sitting in the corner brooding and be like, well, I don't want to be a part of it because you guys are beneath me. I hate you all already. Like, there's not a good way to bring that character into the story, because what logically would happen is I'd be like, okay, well, let's not bring the misanthrope. Let's go do this. And then you get left behind, problem solved. And unless you have something like the gods chaining you to this party or there being a massively negative consequence that's kind of just ham fisted in there, there's no reason for the party to bring you. And so people will try to be like nice and be like, oh, well, we're going to bring him anyways, or, we're going to get you involved because that's the character you've brought to the table. But inevitably, it's not going to work because no one has a reason to interact with you. They have no bonds. They have no reason to tolerate a character who is so intolerant of everyone else. So if you want to make it work, you need to create those bonds. And you can actually do that before the game starts. I've talked about this in a few other videos, but I absolutely adore how the Powered by the Apocalypse game system does bonds and flaws and things like that. Before the game starts, the characters say, you are my brother, or you saved me in my time of need, or I gave you something valuable when you were a kid. Something that creates a reason for the party to be together. I'm not saying that the Cold Start Tavern can't work, but I am saying that very rarely do good stories start that way. The party falls apart, or more than likely, people say, well, I don't really feel a connection to my character or to the party, so I want to try a different character. And all of a sudden, the party you started with 3 sessions later is a completely different party because everyone's swapping characters because no one cares about each other. So please do a bond or a flaw, something with other people for that character to have a reason to stick around. And as I said at the beginning, you can do something to limit the trope. Don't use the full trope or use it sparingly, right? Maybe a moment of humility. I prefer to be on my own, but I know I can't handle this task alone, so I am going to rely on these strangers. Maybe a different flaw, a little bit of show-offiness. I don't want to be a part of this, but it's a good chance for me to stand out and show all these people how much better I am than them. Adding more dynamics to it again gives reason for them to be a part of that party and reason to push the story forward. And that's going to go into tip number 3. Push the story forward. If your roleplay isn't pushing the story forward, then you're just wasting everyone's time. Now, granted, this does not need to be some groundbreaking, we're finding revelations about characters or we're learning something new every single session. Even simple moments like sitting at camp and training together, cooking a meal together to make small talk and learn about something you didn't know about the character. Even as simple as, oh, they like apples. That's what I mean by pushing the story forward. Something is always making the characters become more real, fleshing the characters out more, or adding to the world. So when people like to do dumb one-off jokes like, well, I want to go fart on the gnome. Like, yes, it might establish a little bit of the character or it might be moving them forward, but chances are if you've made a character who's going to fart on a gnome, people already know your character's a jerk. You're not adding anything to the story. You're not developing your character. You're just taking up time. In the same way that the I don't want to join the party or I'm a miserable loner and everyone's beneath me doesn't add anything to the story. Your character's been established, but if their answer is going to keep being, well, I'm so much better than you, why would I join you? That's not adding to the story. That's just grinding it to a hole while everyone else has to try and push the story forward by giving you ropes of, okay, what about this? Will you latch onto this? Will you pull yourself out of this hole with this? Everyone else is doing the work and you're just grinding it all to a halt. Stop doing that. For the same reason, the party should always be pushing the story forward for the exploration and combat reasons the same. If somebody just said, oh, well, I want to go to the park, I as a DM might ask, well, why? What's there for you? If they say, oh, well, I want to look for this, or I heard a rumor about this, or I want to explore this part, that's great. We should do that. That'll build the character and pushes the story forward. But if you're just like, well, I want to go to the park, and you say, okay, well, the rest of the party wants to go to the crypt, to go explore this lead for the spooky, scary skeletons invading the town. And you say, well, I don't care about that. I want to go to the park. Okay, what are you going to do there? I don't know. I just don't want to go to this crypt. Okay, but that's not lending yourself to the story. You're just, again, slowing it down, grinding it to a halt, and not adding anything to it. That's not productive to storytelling or roleplay. Tip number 4 is mostly for DMs, but if your DM doesn't do this, encourage them to add it to your game, because it will help the roleplay overall immensely. At the start of the session, at the end of the session, or maybe during like the weekly if you're all in a Discord group and chat regularly, you should always be asking 1 or 2 questions a week to help flesh out those characters. There's no such thing as too much character development. They can be simple questions like, what's your character's favorite food? What's their favorite smell? They can be deeper. What was their favorite memory? If they could go back and undo one mistake, what would it be? If they got enough gold to retire, what would they do? Little things like that can help add a lot of flavor to the world, but it can also help you flesh out your characters a whole lot. It helps you to understand where they're coming from, what their motivations are, why they're continuing to do those things. Which ironically is why a lot of characters that are the trope of like, oh, I have a wife and kid back home and I'm just doing one last job to pay for their college or for them to have a good life or whatever, it falls flat because after you complete that job and you get that money, why would that character stay? If their entire motivation is, I love my kid and my wife so much that I'm doing this one dangerous adventuring job so that I can get the money to give them a good life, once you've gotten paid, why would they stick around? And I honestly think a lot of people struggle with that. They write their characters into a hole and say that my character's main motivation is this, and then once that happens, they have no reason to stick with the party other than, well, I show up every week and we play together, so my character has to still be here. And then that becomes terrible roleplay when your character no longer wants to be there, but you as the player are saying, well, you have to because I want to keep playing. So be very cautious of that. I think it's a very, very common new player trap. I'm going to take a moment to call out one of my players in my current game for this exact scenario, or at least a good enough example. His character's main tie to the party was their father, and through various things, their father was basically no more. And they approached me and said, my character really doesn't have motivation right now. They need a chance to get away from the party. They don't have this connection anymore. So we found a way to swap their character out so they can play as someone else, and that other character will come back at some point when that motivation is restored or when things are fixed or something else happens. But everyone recognized, like, there's no reason for my character to be here, so rather than forcing that character to stay and create bad roleplay, we've moved that character away so they can have that breath to recover, to change, to go through what they need to, and then be reintroduced into the story when it's time. I've forgotten what tip number I'm on, but the next one, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I know this is a sensitive topic, I know this is a hard topic, but we're going to touch on it. Disabilities and Dungeons and Dragons. I know some people are on one side of the fence. The big one that always comes up is like characters in wheelchairs. Like, why would the Lich build their castle wheelchair accessible? Other people bring up, like, what's the point of making a wheelchair character if you're just going to hand wave away all the difficulties that come with it? And then there's, of course, people like, well, I'm in a wheelchair. I want my character to be in a wheelchair. I want to play as someone who is like me. I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. What I am going to touch on is making your character more than just their disability. I'm going to call out another one of my players who is doing a character who has multiple personalities. Now, 99.9% of the time, I say absolutely not to this. Because what ends up happening is people do either, one of my personalities is a murderer, so I'm going to murder hobo randomly. And it'll just be like, oh, we're walking through town. What are you doing? I switched to my murderer's persona and I stabbed the nearest person. I'm so random. And that's awful. It takes a lot of trust to let someone do a character like this in a campaign, and I'm glad that I gave my player that trust, because they are creating such an interesting story with other people, but the main thing that I really have to applaud them on is they know when to share the spotlight. A lot of times, especially again with characters with the multiple personalities, people want the spotlight on them all the time. And being able to give that spotlight to other characters or even assist other characters' growth in scenes is such an amazing skill to have as a role player. And if you take nothing else away from this video, that is the one thing I want you to know. If you want to be a better role player, start by assisting other people. You don't necessarily have to get in the spotlight. Help other people build their stories and their characters up, and you will get better through that. Their character is also more than just this multiple personality. They have backstory, likes and dislikes. They have crafts. They have relationships they've forged with other characters. And that's really the key to doing this well is it can't just be all about that one singular thing. Another great example in media of this is Toph from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Yes, her blindness is brought up as a plot point a few times, and yes, it's even a joke a few times. However, there is so much more to Toph's character than just her blindness. They explore the idea of this really tough, independent girl who just so happens to like Sokka and trying to find that balance between trying to be tough and independent, but also vulnerable and open. They explore the dynamics between Toph and Katara, where Katara represents this order and structure, and Toph wants to get away from that order and structure and live how she wants to live because she's never been able to do that. They explore her ego because she has a little bit of one on her shoulders. They explore the feeling of powerlessness when she loses Appa. And while many of those things are tangibly attached in a indirect way to her disability, there is so much more to it than just she's blind, so XYZ. So I'm not telling you not to make your character with this. What I'm saying is your character needs to be more than just that. Again, they need to have wants, they need to have desires, they need to have flaws, relationships, things to grow, things to lose. I myself in real life have a disability in that I cannot lift over a certain weight. And while, yes, that does come up in some conversations, especially when we're moving heavy boxes or something, I cannot imagine how insufferable I'd be if that was every butt of every conversation was, did you know I can't lift these things? Did you know I'm unable to do this? Like, yes, it is a part of me, but it is such a minor part of me that it hardly ever comes up unless really the story or my life calls for it. Please respect yourself enough as a writer and your character as a character to give them much more than just that one facet. And while this probably belonged way back in the section where I was talking about tropes, I'm going to shout out to one more player. One of the players in my campaign is a barbarian. And so often when people play barbarians, there's like, oh, well, I have to be angry, raging all the time, all about strength. And while, yes, rage is a part of his character, he doesn't let it define absolutely who his character is. His character enjoys things like tea and good smokes. He often finds himself being a voice of reason in the party and doesn't resort to, I rage and muscle and yell, but using calm, cool tactics that he learned in the arena. Socialite stuff from things in his background. Yes, he can use his strength when the situation needs it, but it's not the only tool in his bag. And I know it's very easy, and we've talked about like, oh, well, I'm not the face of the party. I don't have charisma, so I'll let the bard be the one who talks or the paladin who ones talks, and I just sit here and do nothing until they need muscles. No, you don't have to fall into that trope. If your character has enough personality, enough tools in that bag, they have a reason to partake in those conversations, even if they don't have the highest charisma. It's not a min-max thing. It's a matter of a good story. Now, certainly there are times where someone will say, hey, like, obviously I have the most people skills out of all y'all, so let me talk to the king. Yes, that still happens, and yes, that's important, but not every conversation needs to be handled that way. This video is already going on way longer than I anticipated, so let me just do one final tip. Your character doesn't have to be defined by their class. And while yes, some tropes exist for good reasons, such as druids loving nature, bards loving music, and ironically, barbarians liking fighting, that doesn't have to be solely all they're about. Just because your character's a barbarian doesn't mean that they don't enjoy good food and a good show. Perhaps they enjoy fine clothing and socialite society. They don't have to be a bard to enjoy good music. Maybe they like painting, learning new things like crafting with carpentry tools or even alchemy. I'm going to call upon Avatar: The Last Airbender one more time because it's just such a great show with great characters. Look at Sokka. In the early seasons, Sokka presents himself as just a fighter, just a warrior. That's all he is. That is who he is. But by the end of the show, he's a tinkerer, an intellectual, a detective, a painter, an artist. Even though he has spent a great deal of time fighting and being about fighting, it doesn't define who he is solely. In fact, I dare say he would define himself more as an artist or tinkerer than he would as a fighter by the end of the series. So there you have it. A few tips on how to make a better character, not for fighting, not for power, but for roleplay. If there's any tips that you feel are important that I've left out, leave them down in the comments down below. And as always, have a blessed day.